Michael, I understand that you're involved in a 3-year large-scale study of coaching. Can you describe that for me?
Yes, we have. We've just finished a study. It's taken us about 3 years, probably 5 years in total from the time we started it. It's a large study, one of the largest that's been done in the coaching world, looking at leadership in high-stress workplaces and looking at the impact of coaching over and above training alone in high-stress workplaces. How do we develop leaders to be able to manage in complex settings to increase staff productivity, engagement and well-being, and overall to create flourishing environments? And that's really what the study's been about.
And you're cited within the University of Sydney in what department?
In the School of Psychology, the Coaching Psychology unit. So there were 4 people. So there were 4 4 investigators on the study. I was the chief investigator. We also had Gordon Spence, who's now at the University of Wollongong, Paul Atkins, who's at the Australian National University in Canberra. So it was a multi-site study in that sense, and Tony Grant, also from the School of Psychology. So although the research itself is formally through the School of Psychology, we actually incorporated other universities. But the interesting part about it is that we were working in 2 very disparate sort of participant groups. We had a major law firm as one of the high-stress workplaces, and a group of hospitals as the other high-stress workplace. And what was nice about it, one of the things that we looked at was leadership. We think of leadership as being distributed throughout an organisation rather than being situated just in individuals who have formal roles. And so the participants in the workshop and the program were drawn from every sector of the organisation. So, for instance, the chair of the law firm was one of the participants, as were people from the service staff. They were also participants. We had 250 people all up complete the project. Half of those were from the law firm and half were from the hospitals.
Can you talk a little bit about what kinds of things you were looking at within those 2 organizations?
Okay. So at the core of the research was a model that I'd developed, which we called the 4-factor model of leadership. And it's a slightly different take on leadership than most of the current models of leadership. For instance, the transformational leadership model, which talks about the impacts that a leader has on the people that follow. Rather than looking at leadership in terms of impacts, what we were looking at were what were the core capabilities of leaders, and we broke those into 4 factors. The first is what we call perspective-taking capacity.
Could you say it again, please?
Perspective-taking capacity.
Thank you.
So this is the leader's ability to have more complex perspectives on what's going on, both in themselves, in others, and in the system of which they're a part. So their capacity to make or develop bigger meaning or see a bigger perspective. And we see that as being a core driver of leadership. Now, supporting that driver of leadership, or the tools, in a sense, that leaders then use, we saw 3 major areas. They were a sense of purpose. So where is the leader taking, or what is the purpose behind people's behaviour within organisations? And so as leadership is distributed throughout the organisation, what is the purpose that a person brings to their role in that organisation? And how does that inform their leadership within the organisation? So purpose was one of the key factors. Another was mindfulness, and this you can think of really as the self-regulatory component of the model. So the capacity of the leader to be able to be intentional about what they do and to notice what's going on in the moment. So to be able to step back from the events of the moment and be able to make choices. And then the last of the factors is, in a sense, the social component of it, which is really around, it's positivity as the factor. It's the capacity of the leader to create positive emotional spaces, to create spaces which invite people into their purpose and into action, and feel that motivate people, I guess. So I think all of those factors, the perspective-taking capacity, the mindfulness, the positivity and the purpose, are all critical features of great leaders. And we know this from our own lives. The people that really help us change, they're not really the people that tell us how to do stuff. They're the people that see us in a bigger way than we see ourselves and are able to lead us into that new vision of ourselves. Or they see the challenge that we face, or help us to see the challenge that we face, whatever that might be, in a bigger context and with a bigger perspective. And somehow it's that bigger perspective that opens up possibilities for new types of action and new types of change.
And it is part of the thesis of the study that these are necessary in any kind of leadership, but would become even more necessary in a high-stress environment or something like that?
Yeah, the thesis of the study, and why we've focused on perspective-taking capacity, is, and it goes back to a statement that Albert Einstein made, that a problem can't be solved with the same level of thinking that creates it. And what that really means is that when people are stuck in a problem, typically it's because there is a dilemma or a paradox for them that comes out of the way that they make meaning. And so that there's an assumption, or the two horns of the dilemma can't be resolved because the thinking holds the place, holds that dilemma in place. What I think great leaders are able to do is to take the perspectives that are in opposition and to look at them and step back from them, if you like, make them object, and to see a bigger perspective that incorporates what's important about both of the perspectives, but enlarges the perspective, so that that dilemma, in a sense, disappears and the new possibilities of action are enabled. And so, sorry, I've forgotten the question. What was it?
I was wondering whether these capacities are even more important in a high-stress environment.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the fact that you chose such high-stress environments that I'm familiar with.
Well, I think high-stress environments are high-stress because people are caught in dilemmas that they can't see solutions for. And so that capacity to be able to see a bigger perspective, to find a perspective that actually organises those lower level perspectives, if you like, that capacity is critically important in high stress workplaces, because otherwise you just get stuck in the stress as opposed to see a new or innovative or creative pathway forward. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you measured these capacities in the leaders in these organizations?
So we had lots and lots of different measures of all the different capacities. So in terms of perspective taking, we see perspective taking capacity as a developmental thing, and followed largely Robert Kegan's subject or constructive developmental model around perspective taking. There's some differences in the way that we've articulated it, but for the purposes of this, that's a good definition. The subject-object interview that Leahy and Kegan have developed as a measure of that, we also ran. So it's one of the biggest, I think actually the biggest use of that instrument. That was one of the ways of measuring it. We also developed a pen and paper test of developmental stages, which we called the developmental stage inventory. And we've been analysing that data, and that looks very promising. In terms of mindfulness, we use the Philadelphia Mindfulness Scale, and positivity was measured through through a range of different measures around well-being, psychological well-being, depression, anxiety scales, and so on. The idea of purpose we developed in instrument for, which we call the Solution Focused Index. So lots of different measures. We've also got a whole bunch of different interviews that we're going to do qualitative analysis on too.
I can't resist. Did you find anything that really surprised you?
Well, yes. I mean, a lot of the findings are the ones that you would expect. So that people who were coached within the organisations had significant shifts in terms of their capacity to be solution focused, to be purposeful, to their well-being, the quality of their interactions with others. We found all of those, and you'd sort of expect those. One of the things that I think is a real benefit to the study, and something that's quite new, is that the theory would suggest that developmental shifts, to be able to take bigger perspectives, often takes some time. And what we've found is that we can actually scaffold those developmental shifts. And that's the first time, I think, that has been shown in a study. And so that's good. It's what we hoped would happen, so it's not entirely surprising, but it's great that we've found that. And so
can you give us an example of what that might look like?
Okay, so the way that we make meaning about challenges and understand challenges in our world, there's several different ways that people might make meaning at different stages of development. So for instance, you might look at the world through, how does this affect your needs? That might be one way of making meaning. You might look at it through the lens of the wider group. To what degree is my response in conformity to the norms of the wider group? Or you might look at it in terms of, to what degree is my response in conformity with my own sense of integrity and my own vision of what's going on, and so on. What we found in the study was that people's sense of, according to the theory, leadership really starts with a sort of a systematic view, the capacity to be able to see, step back from one's own personal system and start to see it. What we found was that there was a drop in the meaning making, which came from a very needs-based sort of place. We also found that amongst the leaders who were coached, there was a reduction in their need to be congruent with the group. So that what that means is they were able to stand outside the group in making a decision, if you like.
Which fits in with what you said about their needing to have a larger perspective to be able to step back.
That's right. So they could hold the tension of not being the same as everyone else more effectively. We also saw an increase in their capacity to think about what their response should be, and to be able to prosecute that. And finally, we also saw an increase in their capacity to be able to actually adapt who they are in responding. And so all of those reactions, I think, are, in the desired direction.
Can I shift to the other side? And what did you find about the competencies or what worked best about the coaches that you used in this project?
Right. Another part of the project was we looked at how did the coaches change across the course of the coaching. So one of the things that we were developing in the project was a model of developmental coaching. And what we found was that the coaches themselves had significant transformational shifts in the way that they saw themselves and they saw their coaching. So it was not only the people being coached, but the coaches also. We also looked at the impact of training alone versus coaching following training versus a waitlist control group. And as you might expect, the people who received coaching had greater degrees of improvement, and they were maintained at 12-month follow-up, whereas people who received coaching typically either received training alone, typically would have made a bit of an improvement initially following training, but that dropped away.
Can I go back a little bit?
Yeah.
What do you think you're learning from the fact that the coaches themselves transformed as well as the participants?
So there are different sorts of coaching that one can do. You can do skills coaching, you can do performance coaching, remedial coaching, and what we've called developmental coaching, which is really a sort of a transformational type of coaching. Now, when that's done well, it is a genuine dialogue, if you like, between the coach and the coachee, that the two people actually are both engaged in the process. It's hard to scaffold someone into a perspective, a bigger perspective, when you can't take that perspective yourself.
Not only hard, maybe impossible.
Well, many would say impossible. I think there is maybe the potential to be able to produce some support structures, but nevertheless. And what we've found is that in really being in a dialogical way involved in the challenge that the leaders were involved in, the coaches themselves grew through that process. And I think there's something very important about the connection that happens when you're doing developmental coaching, which involves an expertise on the part of the coach. But I like to think of it as an expertise that is beyond the expert role. So it sounds a bit funny there. It's sort of, in order to do developmental coaching well, you do need to know stuff. So you need to have some expert knowledge, but you also need to be able to hold that very lightly. Now, an expert-centred coaching approach holds one's knowledge and expertise quite tightly. A non-expert role can hold it very lightly, but it does require that you have it, if you know what I mean. And so I think that what we've discovered in the process is that it's only when we can actually hold that knowledge extraordinarily lightly and be present with the client in the midst of the dilemma that they face, and yet still be able to step back from that dilemma and scaffold a larger perspective, that developmental shift really works.
Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
Love this.
So,
what's next?
What's next? There's another component to the study that we've done, which is looking at, so there's three major components. The first is what happens with the people who've been coached, what happened with the coaches, and finally what we were calling the ripple effect. What happens in the organisation in relationships beyond the coach, so the coachee. So, and we're going out a number of steps. So, what are the impacts on the people with whom the coachee or the leader is engaged, and also what are the impacts with whom those people are engaged as well? And stepping out a number of steps there. And that, I think, is the new and exciting part of the research. So we've been using, one of my PhD students, Sean O'Connor, has been using social network analysis to try and get at those issues. One of the interesting parts about this is that in psychology, much of the statistical methods that we have to understand change are very linearly based. So they're based on a model of A leads to B leads to C. Whereas what we know in complex systems is that it's a non-linear system, and it needs non-linear ways of understanding change in that system. And this is relatively new in the world of psychology, in fact generally relatively new. And so we're still developing ways of understanding change across systems. And that, I think, is exciting, and I think that's what's next. How do we understand the ripple effect in coaching, and how the impacts of coaching fan out across the system?
And what you can do that's going to maximize that, and what might happen that would get in the way, those kinds of questions.
Yeah, what's really interesting about that is it's often quite unpredictable. So, for instance, what we seem to be finding is that as people who have been coached develop better quality relationships with some, other sorts of impacts or unintended consequences come in. Other people in the system may then feel a bit excluded because There's a change in the pattern of relationships and so on. And so being able to understand how that all works out may lead to some capacity to be able to be engaged with the process across time more effectively. And I use that term advisedly. I don't mean predict what will happen, because I think it's so complex it's almost impossible to predict, and many would say actually theoretically impossible to predict. But how do we stay engaged with the effects as they start to pan out across the organisation so that we can help to moderate them across time, I think is an important learning, I guess.
One other thing occurred to me, I think because of another interview we did. I think you said that you did this through all levels of both organizations. So
Yes.
you were not only coaching at the top, but you were coaching all the way down.
Yep.
Is there anything coming through this about the difference between the intervention of coaching at the top or somewhere in a middle level? Anything like that? Or is that beyond?
Yeah, well, while we've got 250 people, if you try and break it up into those levels, we don't have sample sizes big enough to make sensible statements about that. Yeah, we can break it up into the two different organisations and look at how they're different, but beyond that it becomes a bit different. Difficult, male, female, those big broad categories we can look at. Yeah.
So if somebody one of our members, say, wants to see the results of the study or wants to follow your work, how do they do that?
Well, we've started the publication process now. They can always send me an email. I'm happy to send the slides, and I believe the slide decks will be up on the Institute website, so they'll be able to have a bit of a look at that. But get in touch, and happy to have a chat to people.
Very cool.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joan. Cheers.